The wind slithered through the skeletal trees like an unseen force, carrying with it the sharp bite of the oncoming night. The scent of damp earth clung to the air, mingling with the distant smell of wood smoke from a village too far away to offer any real warmth. The dirt road beneath my boots was uneven, cracked from the bitter Romanian winters, lined with patches of frost that caught the last golden rays of a dying sun. The sky had begun its slow descent into darkness, the horizon painted in muted shades of burnt orange and deepening violet, while shadows stretched long and thin across the barren fields. I had been walking back toward my cabin, arms stiff from the weight of firewood, my thoughts fixed on nothing in particular, when a sound broke through the hush, a fragile, trembling whimper, almost swallowed by the wind. It was not the sound of a creature merely calling out, but something deeper, rawer, a plea laced with exhaustion. I stopped mid-step, listening. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. A dog stood just beyond the road's edge, half hidden in the tall, brittle grass, her body tense yet visibly weak, every breath pressing against the sharp ridges of her exposed ribs. Her coat, once white perhaps, or golden, was darkened with dust and matted with filth, clinging in patchy tufts to her thin frame. But it was her eyes that held me still, wide and unblinking, filled with something deeper than hunger or fear. They searched me, pleaded with me, though she did not move toward me, as if torn between hope and the primal instinct to run. At her feet, curled into small, shaking bundles against the cold earth, were 3 tiny puppies, their fur speckled with dirt, their bodies stiff with hunger and exhaustion. One barely twitched as she let out another low, desperate whine, nudging them protectively with her snout, as if reminding them she was still there, still holding on. Their tiny ears flicked at the movement, but none of them had the energy to lift their heads. I could see the way her front legs trembled as she tried to stay standing, the way she kept positioning herself between them and me. Even in her frail state, her mother's instinct stronger than her failing body. For a moment, I simply stood there, frozen in place. I wasn't an animal rescuer, wasn't the kind of person who had ever been faced with something like this before. But there was something about the way she had come to me, something about the choice she had made in that moment. To trust a human, to risk approaching me, to fight every urge telling her to run in order to stand there and beg for help. It wasn't just hunger that had brought her to this point. She was out of options, out of time. I took a slow step forward, my breath fogging in the cold air as I lowered myself to the ground, trying to make myself smaller. "Hey there, girl," I murmured, my voice barely above the wind. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." She flinched but didn't back away, her ears flattening, her body torn between trust and survival. The puppies stirred weakly, their tiny paws twitching, their bellies too hollow to make a sound. I glanced up and down the road, scanning the endless, open land. There were no houses, no signs of shelter, no clues as to where they had come from or how long they had been out here. Just an empty stretch of land, a freezing night closing in, and a mother who had run out of strength but not out of love. I felt something tighten deep in my chest. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. But I knew one thing: I couldn't walk away. The moment hung in the cold air, stretching between me and the trembling figures in front of me. My breath came slow and deliberate, misting in the dimming light as I took another cautious step forward. The mother dog, Mara, as I would later call her, stood stiff, her ears twitching at every movement, her golden brown eyes flicking between me and her puppies, as if weighing whether I was salvation or another threat. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something stale, perhaps the remnants of whatever scraps she had scavenged in desperation. I crouched lower, my hands open in front of me, trying to shrink the distance without pushing her over the edge. Her body was a battlefield of instinct. She wanted to trust, wanted to believe that approaching me had been the right choice, but years of surviving had taught her otherwise. Her ribs jutted out like fragile bones beneath a threadbare coat, and up close, I could see the raw patches of skin where hunger and the harsh elements had taken their toll. Her legs, thin as reeds, quivered against the weight of keeping herself upright. The puppies barely moved, curled against her like tiny living stones. One, smaller than the others, with a patch of black across his eye, shifted weakly, letting out a whimper so faint it barely cut through the hush. My gut clenched. They were running on nothing but the will to survive, their little bodies too frail to cry properly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread, something I had packed earlier, though I barely remembered bringing it. I tore off a bit and held it out, letting the scent drift toward her, waiting to see if hunger would override fear. Mara's nose twitched, her body leaning forward just a fraction, but she hesitated, eyeing me as if trying to solve an impossible equation. Slowly, carefully, I set the bread down in front of me and backed off just enough to give her space. Seconds passed, stretched long and silent. Then, finally, she took a step. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine. She sniffed the bread, pausing for what felt like an eternity before snapping it up, swallowing without even chewing. I could see the way her muscles tightened, waiting to see if there was a catch, if I would suddenly lunge or take something from her in return. When nothing happened, she licked her lips and flicked her gaze to me again. "Good girl," I murmured, my voice barely above the rustle of the wind. "It's okay." Her ears twitched at the sound, and for the first time, the sharpness in her expression softened, if only slightly. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. A small fracture in the wall between us. But then, just as I dared to inch closer, the smallest puppy let out a sudden, sharp cry, a tiny, shrill sound that echoed unnaturally in the quiet. Mara spun instantly, her body going rigid, her protective instincts flaring so fast it was like a switch had been flipped. A deep warning growl rumbled from her throat, her body lowering, her teeth flashing just enough to remind me that despite her weakened state, she would fight if she had to. I froze, holding up my hands. "Hey, it's all right, I get it," I said softly. My pulse had quickened, but I didn't move. I understood what she was saying. The rescue, if it could even be called that yet, would not be as simple as offering food and hoping for trust. She was still a mother, still a protector, and if I wanted to help them, I would have to prove myself, earn my place in the fragile world she had built around her pups. The sky had deepened into a smoky blue, the last hints of sunlight clinging stubbornly to the horizon, and the air had taken on a sharper edge. Night was coming fast, and with it, the temperature would plummet. They wouldn't survive out here much longer. My chest tightened at the realization. I had come out here looking for firewood, expecting nothing more than the usual quiet evening. But as I looked at the mother dog still poised between me and her puppies, her frail body still standing despite everything working against her, I knew this was no longer a choice. I had to find a way to bring them with me. The only question was, how? The night crept in like an unwelcome visitor, wrapping the countryside in a biting cold that gnawed through my jacket and stung against my skin. The wind, no longer softened by the setting sun, carried an eerie stillness, making the open fields around me feel even more abandoned. Mara remained where she was, her frail frame coiled like a rusted spring, her eyes darting between me and her puppies, still uncertain whether I was a lifeline or just another threat. The trust I had managed to chip away at moments ago had been shaken by the smallest cry from her pup, and now we were back where we started. I needed a plan. I couldn't leave them out here. The temperature had already begun to drop, and the puppies were in no state to endure the night's full brutality. If I turned away now, I wouldn't be coming back to 3 shivering bundles of life by morning. I'd be coming back to frozen little bodies, to a mother curled around them in silent grief. That thought settled like a weight inside me, making my pulse quicken. I crouched again, slow and deliberate, letting the minutes stretch between us, allowing her to feel that I wasn't pushing her, wasn't demanding anything from her. My hand hovered over my bag, and I pulled out the remains of a dried sausage I had packed for my own meal, tearing it into small pieces and setting them on the ground in front of me. The scent of it caught Mara's attention immediately. Her nose flared, and for the first time, I saw the internal war she was fighting. Her body remained rigid, protective, but her stomach betrayed her, letting out a low, hollow growl that I knew wasn't a warning. It was hunger. She hesitated, then took a step forward. I barely breathed as she inched closer, her paws hesitant, her body tense, but her hunger overriding her fear just enough to risk it. She lowered her head, sniffed the offering, then quickly snapped up the food before retreating just as fast. It was quick, mechanical, the way a dog that had been fighting for survival for too long learns to eat, as if food could disappear at any second. She swallowed, her tongue darting out to lick the crumbs from her snout, and then, just like before, her eyes locked onto mine. I knew I had to move slowly, but time wasn't on our side. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and the puppies, though still alive, were barely holding on. Their tiny bodies trembled against each other, their breathing uneven. I didn't need to be an expert to see that they were weakening, their bodies surrendering to the cold and hunger. If I didn't get them somewhere warm soon, it wouldn't matter how much food I had to offer. Mara must have sensed it too. She turned, nuzzling them softly, her nose pressing against each of their tiny faces, as if checking that they were still there, still breathing. The smallest one, the one with the dark patch over his eye, stirred weakly at her touch but barely responded. A deep, guttural sound rumbled in her throat, part growl, part whimper. She knew they needed help, but she didn't know if she could trust me to be the one to give it. I made my decision. "I can't leave you out here," I murmured, my voice low, steady. "I don't know what's happened to you or where you came from, but I know you won't make it through the night." I reached slowly behind me, pulling off my jacket, then my sweater beneath it, leaving only the thin layer of my shirt against the cold. Carefully, I laid the sweater out on the ground, just a foot away from them. It wasn't much, but it was warm, thick, something softer than the dirt they had been lying on. "Come on, girl," I coaxed. "For them." She didn't move. For a long moment I thought she wouldn't, that she would let pride, fear, or instinct win over survival. But then, slowly, hesitantly, she turned to her puppies. She nuzzled them again, giving them one last lingering sniff before, one by one, she began gently nudging them toward the fabric. They resisted at first, their tiny bodies weak, confused, but she persisted, pushing them toward the warmth, toward the only option they had left. My throat tightened. I waited, unmoving, as she stepped back, her eyes still locked on me, her body still tense with uncertainty. She had given me her pups, not fully, not with trust, but with hope, or maybe just a lack of another choice. I exhaled slowly, then reached for them, scooping them up into the bundle of fabric, careful not to move too fast, not to startle her. The smallest one barely reacted, his tiny head lolling against my arm. He was dangerously weak. I looked at her again, the silent question hanging between us. "Come with me." She stared back, her ribs rising and falling with each deep breath, her body still resisting the decision her heart had already made. Then finally, she stepped forward, slow and trembling, until she was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. She didn't trust me, but she trusted me enough. That was all I needed. I gathered the puppies closer, rising to my feet. "Let's go home." The walk back felt like a delicate balancing act, every step carrying the weight of something fragile and uncertain. The puppies were bundled in my sweater, their tiny bodies barely stirring against the fabric, while Mara trailed just behind me, her presence a constant shadow against the night. She didn't walk beside me, didn't lean in for reassurance. She simply followed, her paws moving through the dirt with the slow, hesitant steps of an animal caught between fear and obligation. The cold was worsening, seeping through my shirt now that my sweater was wrapped around the pups. The darkness had fully settled, stretching over the countryside like an endless void, broken only by the dim glow of my cabin's porch light in the distance. It wasn't much, just a small wooden structure on the edge of the village, surrounded by trees that swayed in the wind like whispering figures. I wasn't sure what I would do once I got inside, whether Mara would follow me in, whether she'd panic, whether the puppies would even make it through the night. But I knew one thing for certain: they couldn't stay out here. I reached the front steps, shifting my grip on the bundle in my arms. The weight of their tiny bodies felt impossibly light, yet unbearably heavy all at once. I glanced back at Mara. She had stopped just a few feet away, her paws planted firmly in the dirt, her body frozen with uncertainty. "Come on, girl," I said softly, pushing the door open with my foot. Warm air rushed out, carrying the scent of burning wood from the fire I had left smoldering in the hearth. The moment the door cracked open, one of the puppies let out a weak whimper, stirring slightly in my arms. It was barely a sound, but to Mara, it was everything. Her ears twitched, and after one more beat of hesitation, she stepped forward. Inside, the cabin was small but warm, the flickering glow of the fire casting long, shifting shadows against the wooden walls. I moved carefully, laying the sweater down near the hearth, making sure the puppies were as close to the warmth as possible. They barely reacted, their tiny forms curled together in a loose pile, their bellies rising and falling in shallow breaths. The smallest one, who I had started calling Nico in my head, barely moved at all. Mara stepped inside fully now, her nose twitching as she took in the unfamiliar space. She didn't relax, didn't lie down, but she circled the room carefully, her ribs pressing against her skin with every slow inhale. I didn't try to stop her. She needed to know there was no danger, that there was no hidden trap waiting for her inside these walls. I knelt by the puppies, rubbing warmth into their tiny bodies as best I could. "You're okay now," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it for them or myself. Then, just as I began to settle, the first sign of trouble came. Mara's head snapped up suddenly, her ears pricking forward, her body stiffening like a wire pulled too tight. A low guttural growl rumbled from her throat, one that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I followed her gaze toward the door, my heart quickening. A sound, faint at first, then unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching against the frozen dirt outside. I stood slowly, my mind racing. It was late. No one ever came out this far at this hour. The village was miles away, and the nearest farm was at least a 10-minute walk down the road. But someone, or something, was out there. Mara's growl deepened, her body lowering slightly, her instincts taking over. I reached toward the fire poker leaning against the stone hearth, gripping the cold metal handle just as a sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the door. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding against my ribs. Whoever was on the other side wasn't just passing through. They had come for a reason. And something told me that reason had to do with Mara and her puppies. The knock came again, louder this time, a heavy fist against wood that sent vibrations through the cabin's walls. Mara's growl sharpened into something feral, her teeth flashing in the firelight, her body shifting between the door and her puppies as if preparing for a fight. My grip tightened on the fire poker, the cold metal pressing into my palm as I took a slow, steady breath. I wasn't the kind of person who expected trouble. Living out here, people minded their own business, especially after dark. But this wasn't some casual traveler looking for shelter. Whoever stood on the other side of my door had come with purpose. My gut told me to ignore it, to let silence be my answer, but the tension in the air had already settled thick, and whoever was outside wasn't leaving. Another knock. This time, not just a knock, but the sound of a hand testing the door, fingers pressing against the wood, maybe even the handle. I moved forward, careful to position myself between Mara and the entrance, my voice steady despite the unease crawling up my spine. "Who's there?" A pause. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, filling the space where an answer should have been. Then, finally, a voice, low, male, rough like someone who'd spent years smoking or yelling too much. "I'm looking for a dog." The words sent a slow, creeping chill through me. My grip on the poker tightened. "What dog?" "A stray," the man said. "White, thin, had some pups. She came through here earlier." A beat of silence, then the unmistakable sound of boots shifting in the dirt. "You seen her?" I glanced at Mara. She was frozen, every muscle in her frail body coiled tight, her eyes fixed on the door with something beyond fear, something closer to recognition. She knew who was outside, and she wanted nothing to do with them. "I haven't seen anything," I said, my voice even. A long silence followed. Then, the handle rattled. My heartbeat slammed in my chest. This wasn't someone asking. This was someone deciding whether or not they could push their way in. Mara let out a sharp, guttural snarl, one that sent a clear message. If they came through that door, she wouldn't hesitate. Another pause. Then the man let out a low chuckle, dark and humorless. "You might want to be careful," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "A dog like that's bad luck, brings problems, sometimes even worse than that." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Then, without another sound, the footsteps retreated, crunching over the frozen ground, fading into the darkness. I waited, listening, every nerve in my body on edge. When the last trace of sound disappeared into the wind, I exhaled, only then realizing how tight my chest had become. Slowly, I stepped back, lowering the fire poker but not letting go. I glanced at Mara, who had yet to move, her ears still pricked toward the door, her ribs rising and falling in shallow, measured breaths. The puppies were still tucked in my sweater, unaware of how close their fate had just come to shifting. I crouched near Mara, my voice quieter now, gentler. "Who was that?" Of course, she didn't answer. But in the flickering light of the fire, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just fear. Something else. Something older. Something that told me this wasn't just about survival. This was about escape. The fire crackled, filling the silence left in the stranger's wake. But the warmth it gave off did nothing to ease the chill creeping through my veins. The knock, the voice, the way he had tested the door, all of it replayed in my mind, looping like an unsolved puzzle. I had been so focused on saving Mara and the puppies that I hadn't questioned where she had come from. Hadn't thought to ask why she had wandered straight up to me instead of just another passerby. Now, the question wasn't just where she had come from, but what or who she was running from. Mara hadn't moved since the man had left. She was still by the door, ears high, body rigid, her breath controlled but shallow. She was listening, waiting, and I could tell that whatever had been between her and that man, it wasn't over. I took a slow step toward her, crouching down to meet her level, careful not to break the fragile thread of trust she had given me. That guy wasn't just looking for any stray, was he? My voice was soft, but the question carried weight. Mara's golden eyes flicked toward me for only a second before she turned back to the door, as if expecting him to return. The puppies stirred in the bundle of my sweater, letting out small, weak squeaks, their tiny paws twitching. I ran a hand over the fabric, feeling their fragile warmth beneath it. They were still too weak to stand on their own. Whatever had happened before they found me, it had left them in bad shape. I needed answers. Grabbing my coat, I moved toward the door and pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I cracked it open just enough to let the cold night air seep in, my breath fogging immediately as I scanned the darkness. The porch was empty, the dirt road stretching in both directions, with no sign of footprints leading away. But that didn't mean he wasn't still out there, watching, waiting. I shut the door, bolting it. Mara's body eased ever so slightly at the sound, her tail flicking in small, anxious movements. She understood. I moved back toward the fire, throwing another log into the embers, watching the flames rise, painting the room in flickering shades of gold and amber. My mind churned through possibilities. If someone had been searching for Mara and her pups, it meant she had belonged to someone at some point. But who? And why had she been left in such a state, starving, desperate, barely able to stand? The fire popped, breaking the silence, and Mara finally moved. Not toward me, not toward the door, but toward the puppies. She sniffed them, nudging each one softly, as if checking they were still there, still real. Then, slowly, she lay down beside them, her body curling protectively around their small forms. She was exhausted. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into, girl," I murmured, "but you're safe here. I promise." She didn't look at me, didn't react, but she didn't growl either. And I took that as a sign that, for now, it was enough. But as the fire burned lower and the weight of the night settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That man hadn't been looking for Mara. He had been hunting her. And something told me he wasn't going to stop. The fire had burned low, its once bright flames reduced to a quiet smolder of embers, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. The night stretched on, thick and silent, but sleep didn't come. My mind churned, tangled in the weight of everything that had happened. The stranger at my door, the way Mara had reacted, the unspoken history between them that I still didn't understand. I sat by the fire, my elbows resting on my knees, watching Mara where she lay curled around her puppies. She had finally let herself rest, though even in sleep, her body remained tense, her ears twitching at the smallest sounds. Her ribs rose and fell in shallow breaths, exhaustion keeping her still, but I knew the moment anything felt off, she'd be up in an instant, ready to fight. I ran a hand down my face, exhaling slowly. What the hell was I supposed to do now? It wasn't just about taking in a stray dog anymore. I had gotten myself wrapped up in something bigger than I had anticipated. The moment I had opened my door and let them inside, I had made a choice, even if I hadn't realized it yet. But was it the right one? The logical part of me knew I should take them somewhere, anywhere, before things got worse. A shelter in the next town, maybe. There were places that could care for them better than I could. Places that didn't come with the risk of a man knocking on the door in the middle of the night, asking questions that held unspoken threats. But then I looked at Mara, at the slow way her head shifted in her sleep, her body curling tighter around the pups as if shielding them even in unconsciousness. I thought about how she had chosen to come to me, out of all the places, all the people she could have sought out. She had trusted me. Even if it was only by the smallest margin, she had handed me the only things in the world that mattered to her. Could I really turn my back on them now? I glanced at the door, my fingers flexing against my knee. Keeping them meant risk. That much was obvious. That man had been looking for them, and if he had come once, he could come again. And next time, he might not be so quick to walk away. But letting them go meant something else entirely. It meant abandoning them to the unknown, to a world that had already failed them once. If I turned them over to a shelter, would Mara and her pups even stay together? Would she be adopted? Or would she be left in a cold cage, waiting for someone who might never come? I wasn't sure what terrified me more, keeping them and facing the consequences, or letting them go and never knowing if they'd be okay. The smallest puppy stirred in the bundle of my sweater, its tiny body shifting in the warmth. It was still weak, its breathing uneven, but it was alive. They all were. I let out a slow breath. I wasn't ready to decide. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let my fear be the reason I abandoned them. Not after everything they had been through. I leaned back against the wall, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening to the quiet. The decision would have to come soon. But for tonight, I would let them sleep. For tonight, they were safe. The fire had burned low, its golden glow barely stretching beyond the edges of the cabin, the shifting embers casting restless shadows that flickered across the walls like something alive. The night had settled in thick outside, heavy with the weight of something unseen, something waiting. The stillness carried a different kind of silence than before. Not the peaceful hush of the countryside, but the kind that felt too deliberate, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the next move. Mara had been watching the door for nearly an hour, her body curled protectively around her pups, her ears twitching at every creak of the wooden floor, every distant groan of the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Her ribs rose and fell in shallow, measured breaths, her frame exhausted but unwilling to give in to rest. Even in the quiet, she remained alert, her golden eyes flicking toward the windows every few minutes as if expecting something or someone to be lurking just beyond the glass. The tension in her body was a language of its own, one I was only beginning to understand. I shifted in my chair, the weight of the last few hours settling deeper into my chest. The encounter with those men had left a stain on the night, an undeniable presence that refused to fade, even after they had disappeared back into the darkness. The way the man had spoken, his words curling around a threat that hadn't needed to be said outright, gnawed at my thoughts. They hadn't come looking for just any stray dog. They had come looking for her. The fire let out a soft crackle, the wood settling, sending a cascade of tiny embers floating upward before vanishing into the dimness. I reached for my mug, wrapping my fingers around the rough ceramic, but the tea had gone cold, the warmth long stolen by the air. It didn't matter. I wasn't drinking it anyway. My mind was elsewhere, sifting through the puzzle pieces I had, trying to shape them into something that made sense. Mara shifted beside me, drawing my attention. She was no longer watching the door, but looking at me now, her head slightly tilted, her gaze cautious yet unwavering. In the dim light, I could see the sharp angles of her face more clearly, the way her fur thinned around her ribs, the evidence of the hunger and struggle she had endured. But what stood out most was the intelligence in her eyes, the way they held something more than just the simple instinct of an animal. She understood far more than I had given her credit for, and as she stared at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell me something. Slowly, carefully, I moved closer, reaching a hand out just enough to let her decide if she wanted to close the distance. She hesitated, watching my fingers, her ears pulling back slightly, but then, after a moment's deliberation, she leaned forward. Her cold nose brushed against my skin, the contact brief but deliberate. It was the first time she had done that, the first time she had initiated anything beyond her usual guarded wariness. It wasn't trust, not fully, but it was something. It was then, as she shifted again, that I saw it. The wound along her ribs, hidden beneath the dirt-matted fur. The sight of it sent a slow, creeping fire through my chest. The scabbing told me it wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either, the raw edges still holding the faintest hint of red, where the healing process had barely begun. The jagged shape of it wasn't from a fight with another animal, wasn't the result of a scrape against rocks or branches. This was something different, something inflicted with intent. A blade, perhaps. A strike meant to wound, but not to kill. My grip tightened slightly as I exhaled, slow and controlled. The pieces were beginning to align now, the gaps filling in with grim certainty. She hadn't just run, she had escaped. The realization settled heavy in my stomach, something raw and unsteady twisting in my gut. That man at the door, his voice, the way he had spoken about her, the way he had expected me to give her up without question. It all made sense now. He wasn't looking for a lost dog, he was looking for something he had owned. Mara let out a quiet exhale, her body pressing slightly closer to the warmth of the fire, but her eyes never left me, as if gauging my reaction. There was no need to. I already knew what I had to do. I wasn't giving her back. The tension in my shoulders settled into something sharper, something heavier with conviction. I didn't know what kind of life she had escaped from, didn't know what horrors she had endured before finding her way to my doorstep. But I knew one thing for certain, she wasn't going back. Not to them. Not ever. Beyond the walls of the cabin, the night stretched on, vast and watchful. Somewhere out there, I knew those men were still lurking, still waiting, still convinced that this wasn't over. And maybe they were right. Maybe it wasn't. But if they thought I was going to roll over and let them take her, they had another thing coming. The firelight flickered across the wooden walls, casting shifting shadows that made the small cabin feel even smaller. The weight of realization sat heavy in my chest. Mara hadn't just been abandoned, she had escaped. The wound along her ribs was proof of that, the fresh scabbing telling me that whatever had happened to her, it wasn't in the distant past. Someone had hurt her, and someone had been trying to find her. I shifted my gaze to the puppies, still curled together in the bundle of my sweater, their tiny bodies rising and falling in slow, unsteady breaths. They were still too weak, still fragile in a way that made something protective coil deep in my gut. They weren't just survivors of the cold, they were survivors of him. Mara watched me with cautious, tired eyes. Even in her pain, even in her exhaustion, there was still a part of her that didn't trust me completely. She was waiting for me to turn, for the moment I might become another human who failed her. I needed to show her that wasn't going to happen. Moving slowly, I reached for the small metal pot near the fire, pouring a bit of warm water into a bowl. I pulled a clean rag from the drawer, soaking it lightly before kneeling beside her. "All right, girl," I murmured. "This is gonna sting a little." Her ears flicked, and she stiffened, but she didn't move away as I brought the cloth to her wound. The moment the warm water met her skin, she flinched hard, a low growl rumbling in her throat, but she didn't bite, she didn't snap. She just let out a slow, shaking breath and let me help. I cleaned the wound carefully, wiping away the dirt that had stuck to the scabbing edges, working in slow, steady movements so she wouldn't panic. She winced a few times but never pulled away. It was the first real moment of trust she had given me, and I wasn't going to take it for granted. When I was done, I reached for a small piece of leftover sausage, breaking off a bit and holding it out to her. "You're tougher than you look," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I'd say you deserve this." She hesitated, but then with careful, precise movements, she leaned forward and took the food from my palm, swallowing it quickly before licking her lips. A slow smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. That was progress. I sat back, exhaling as I stretched my sore shoulders. The weight of the past few hours pressed down hard, but as I looked at her, curled protectively around her pups, still watching me, still assessing me, I realized something. I wanted them here. Not out of obligation, not because I had been forced into it, but because some part of me needed them as much as they needed me. I had lived alone for so long, the silence of the countryside my only company, but for the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel so empty. It felt alive. I glanced at the door, my jaw tightening slightly, but he was still out there somewhere, and that meant none of us were safe yet. I wasn't sure what my next move was, but I knew one thing. I wasn't giving her back. The early morning came slow, dragging through the cold air like an unwanted weight. I hadn't slept, not really. Even when exhaustion settled into my bones, my mind refused to quiet, replaying the events of the night before. The knock on the door, the slow, deliberate way that man had spoken, the lingering threat in his voice. You might want to be careful. A dog like that brings problems. That wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Mara shifted near the fire, her body still curled protectively around her pups, but there was no true rest in the way she lay. Her ears twitched at every creak of the wooden walls, every flicker of movement beyond the cabin, her instincts keeping her trapped in a limbo between exhaustion and vigilance. She had spent too long in survival mode, too long waiting for the world to turn on her. She had no reason to believe this would be any different. The fire had burned low, its warm glow dimming as the outside world grew colder, the early light of morning barely making a difference against the frost that clung to the ground. I pulled on my coat and stepped onto the porch, my breath fogging the air as the cold pressed in. Everything was silent, unnaturally so, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. My boots crunched against the frost-bitten dirt, and as my eyes scanned the open space beyond my land, I felt the unease settle deeper in my gut. That's when I saw them, footprints. Fresh, leading from the tree line at the far edge of the property, stopping just a few feet from my porch before turning back. Someone had been here, watching, waiting, deciding whether or not to make their move. A slow, burning heat settled in my chest as I crouched down, running my fingers lightly over the disturbed earth. The tracks were deeper than before, pressed firmly into the dirt. There wasn't just one set of prints this time. There were two, maybe even three. That changed everything. This wasn't a single man searching for a lost dog. This was something bigger, something organized, something that wouldn't go away just because I said no. Behind me, Mara let out a low, uneasy whimper, stepping onto the porch, but keeping close to the doorway. Her body low, her tail stiff, her eyes locked onto the same tree line where the tracks had appeared. She knew what I knew now. This wasn't over. I ran a hand over my face, my mind sifting through options, but the choices were thin. I could take Mara and the pups and disappear before they came back, but that meant abandoning everything I had built, throwing myself into a fight I didn't fully understand. Or I could stand my ground and make it clear that whatever they thought was going to happen, they were wrong. A voice cut through the cold before I had time to think it through any further. "Hey there, friend." I turned sharply, my body tensing as I spotted them walking up the dirt road. Two men, moving slow, deliberate, the same way a predator moves when it knows the chase has already begun. One of them was the man from last night. The other was bigger, broader in the shoulders, with a heavy coat and boots caked in dried mud. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. Mara's growl was barely audible, a low vibration in the cold air, but her posture spoke louder than sound ever could. She didn't just recognize them, she feared them. I stepped off the porch, meeting them halfway, keeping my stance relaxed even though my entire body was wound tight beneath my skin. "You lost?" My voice was steady, even, giving nothing away. The first man smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the barest curl of amusement at the edges. "Nah, just thought I'd check in, see if you remembered anything about that dog I was asking about." His eyes flicked toward my cabin, lingering just long enough to make sure I knew what he was implying. "Seems like you've got company." I kept my expression neutral. "Found some strays last night. Poor things were half frozen." "That so?" His lips twitched, but his amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. The second man, the stockier one, let out a quiet chuckle, his voice rough like gravel. "Strays, huh? That's funny, 'cause we lost one recently, and she had pups too." His tone was slow, deliberate, as if testing me, waiting to see if I'd flinch. The tension between us thickened, the cold pressing in tighter. I tilted my head slightly, watching them the same way they were watching me. "That right?" The first man took a step forward, just enough to close the space between us by a fraction, his movements measured. Not aggressive, not yet, but pressing, testing. "Yeah, real special dog too. Means a lot to us. Wouldn't want her ending up in the wrong hands." Mara's growl deepened, her stance shifting slightly, her body angling protectively toward the cabin, toward her pups. The second man's gaze flicked toward her, lingering for a moment before he turned his attention back to me, his expression darkening ever so slightly. "How about we take a look? Make sure she's not the one we're missing." There it was, the move, the test. They weren't asking. They were waiting to see if I'd fold, waiting to see if I was the kind of man who could be nudged aside like an obstacle in the road. I exhaled slowly, shifting my stance just enough to let them know I wasn't that kind of man. "Not gonna happen," I said, my voice calm even. "You want to find your dog, try the shelter in town." For a brief second, something flickered in the first man's eyes. Not anger, not yet, but something colder. A calculation. Then he let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "Shame," he murmured. "Really is." The stocky man took a step back, slipping his hands into his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. "Guess we'll be seeing you around." They turned, walking back the way they had come, their boots crunching against the frozen earth. I didn't move. I stayed standing where I was, watching them until they disappeared behind the trees, waiting until the air settled and the quiet stretched long again. Only then did I let out a slow, controlled breath. Behind me, Mara hadn't moved. Her ears were still pinned back, her ribs rising and falling in short, shallow breaths, her body still tense with the kind of fear that wasn't easily erased. She wasn't afraid of just anyone. She was afraid of them. And now I knew for certain. They weren't done. The sky darkened in slow, creeping waves. The last traces of daylight, swallowed by thick clouds, stretched across the countryside like a heavy, waiting shroud. The fire in the hearth burned warm, casting flickering light against the wooden walls, but the warmth did nothing to ease the tension knotting in my chest. My mind ran through every detail of the earlier encounter, replaying the way those men had looked at me, the careful way they had chosen their words. They weren't going to walk away. Mara hadn't moved from her spot near the fire, but she was far from relaxed. Her ears twitched at every sound, her golden brown eyes flicking toward the door every time the wind shifted outside. Her body remained curled protectively around the pups, her breathing slow but alert, her mind no doubt running through the same fears as mine. She had lived with fear for longer than I had. She knew when danger wasn't finished. I stood from my chair, moving toward the small window beside the door. The night had settled into complete darkness, the only light coming from the distant glow of the village far beyond the hills. My land was isolated, too far for anyone to hear trouble, too open to hide if someone was determined enough. A cold unease settled deeper in my stomach as I stared into the blackness beyond the trees. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A flicker of movement. Not the wind, not an animal, a shape. Then another. They were back. I turned sharply, pulling the lantern from the windowsill, dousing the light in one quick motion. The fire was still glowing behind me, but at least the cabin wouldn't cast a beacon through the glass anymore. Mara lifted her head, sensing the shift in my energy, her body tensing beneath her thin frame. "Stay here," I murmured, though I knew she wouldn't understand the words. She didn't need to. She understood the change in my stance, the way my muscles coiled as I moved toward the door, my steps controlled, deliberate. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees, but it wasn't enough to cover the sound of footsteps. They weren't trying to be loud, but they weren't trying to be invisible either. They wanted me to know they were here, that they had come back. I reached for the fire poker beside the hearth, wrapping my fingers around the cold iron handle. It wasn't much, but it was something. A weight in my palm that felt steadier than the pounding in my chest. A sound. A hand on the doorknob. I gritted my teeth, every muscle in my body locking into place as the handle twisted, the slow scrape of metal against metal cutting through the silence. It didn't open. They were testing it. Seeing if I had locked it, seeing if I was inside. Mara let out a low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated through the wooden floor. The pups stirred at the sound, their tiny bodies shifting beneath her, but they didn't wake. Then a voice, him. "Come on now," the man from before murmured, his tone smooth, casual, like he was asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "No need to make this difficult." I didn't answer. Another knock, this one harder. Not testing, demanding. "You've got something that don't belong to you," he continued, his voice thick with that same slow, creeping amusement. "Figured I'd come by, give you a chance to make things right. No harm done." I clenched my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. This wasn't about making things right. This was about power, control, a sick, twisted game. He was waiting for me to fold, waiting for me to cave the way most people probably did when faced with something bigger, something they didn't understand. But I wasn't most people. The silence stretched, long and suffocating, but I didn't move. Then, without warning, the door shook. A hard kick, not enough to break it down, just enough to make a point. Mara was on her feet now, standing over the pups, her lips curling back, her body vibrating with fury. I tightened my grip on the fire poker, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then another kick, harder. The wood groaned, the old hinges rattling against the frame. And then the voice, low, quiet, coiled with warning. "Open the door, boy. Don't make us do this the hard way." I exhaled, slow and measured, my grip tightening until my knuckles ached. The hard way. That's what they wanted. A fight, an excuse. Something to remind me that I wasn't the one in control. Another thud. Mara snarled. The sound was deeper than before, raw and primal, the kind of noise that sent a warning through the marrow of your bones. I had no doubt she would fight if they got inside, but she was weak, wounded. She wouldn't stand a chance, and that's when I knew. I couldn't let them inside. I made my choice. I moved quickly, grabbing the shotgun from where it rested against the far wall. Not loaded, not even cleaned in months, but they didn't know that. I threw the bolt back loud enough for the metal to sing. The silence outside was immediate. Then I stepped closer to the door, my voice steady, low, cold. "You take one more step toward this door, and I swear to God, I'll put you in the ground." Another pause, this time longer. Then the sound of boots shifting against the frozen ground. I imagined them exchanging looks, assessing, calculating. Then a slow, deliberate chuckle. "Ain't no need for that now," the man said, his voice still light but with an edge beneath it. "We were just having a conversation." "You want a conversation? Go have it somewhere else," I shot back. "You're not getting what you came for." Silence. Then slowly, the footsteps retreated. They weren't in a hurry, weren't afraid, just satisfied. And somehow that was worse. I waited, listening, not moving until I was sure they were gone. Only then did I exhale, my muscles still locked tight with tension. My hands shook slightly as I lowered the gun, my pulse still hammering in my skull. Mara hadn't moved, her body still rigid, her eyes still fixed on the door. I turned toward her, swallowing hard. "They'll be back." She didn't react, but she didn't need to. We both knew it was true. The fire had burned down to a low, pulsing glow, the cabin thick with the scent of charred wood, and something else, something heavier. Fear, tension, the kind that settled in the bones and didn't leave. My hands still ached from gripping the shotgun, though I had set it aside now, the weight of it replaced by something just as heavy. They had backed off, but not because they were done. Mara hadn't relaxed. She still stood near the pups, her body locked in a tense coil, her ears flicking toward every sound outside. She knew as well as I did that we weren't safe yet. The men would come back, but next time they wouldn't test the door or play their little intimidation games. Next time they would come ready. And I had to decide what the hell I was going to do before that happened. My legs felt stiff as I moved toward the window, careful not to step too loudly. The outside world was nothing but darkness, thick and endless, pressing against the glass like something waiting to swallow us whole. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of light that didn't belong. The men had retreated, but they hadn't gone far. I could feel it, that weight of being watched, of being hunted. I turned away, running a hand through my hair, exhaling slow. Options. I needed options. If I stayed here, I was giving them the advantage. They had the numbers, the weapons, the experience. I had a fire poker, an old shotgun, and a wounded dog with 3 starving pups. If I ran, I might buy time, but I had nowhere to go. The village was miles away, and dragging a weak mother dog and her newborns through the freezing cold in the middle of the night would be a death sentence in itself. Mara shifted, letting out a soft whine, her body pressing closer to the pups, her nose nudging them gently. She was protecting them, even now, even when she could barely stand. A sharp sting built in my throat, something tangled between frustration and guilt. I should have been able to protect her. I should have been able to stop this before it got this far. I crouched beside her, rubbing a hand along the thin fur of her neck, feeling the tension beneath her skin. "I won't let them take you," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes met mine, tired but filled with something that hadn't been there before: trust. The wind howled outside, rattling against the cabin walls, and then from the distance, a sound cut through it. Engines. I froze. Mara tensed beneath my touch, her body going rigid, her ears pinning back so hard they nearly vanished into her fur. The pups stirred, whimpering softly, their tiny forms pressing closer together. They were coming back. My breath came slow, controlled, but my mind was already running through the next steps. I reached for the shotgun again, my fingers curling around the stock. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My gaze flicked toward the back door. I needed an escape plan. The growl that rumbled from Mara's throat was so deep it sent a vibration through the wooden floor. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. But she didn't understand. If they got in here, if they found her, there wouldn't be a fight. There would be an ending. The engines cut off. Silence. Then footsteps. They were faster this time, more direct. The hesitation from before was gone. This was an attack. I moved quickly, grabbing the bundle of pups, careful not to jostle them too much as I wrapped them in the sweater. I didn't have time to think. I just knew I had to move. "Come on, girl," I whispered. "We have to go. Now." Mara hesitated, her instincts torn between protecting her pups and facing what was coming head-on. I didn't give her time to decide. I pushed the back door open, the wind slamming against my face like a wall of ice. The night stretched out before us, endless and merciless, but it was our only shot. I stepped out first, keeping my body close to the cabin wall, shielding the pups from the cold as best I could. Mara followed, her body low, moving with silent precision despite her weakness. She was a survivor. She knew how to move unseen. A shout rang out from the front of the house. Then, the unmistakable crash of wood splitting. They had broken the door. Adrenaline surged through my body, a sharp electric fire, but I forced myself to stay steady. We weren't out yet. I took off toward the trees, my steps sure, my pulse hammering in my skull. Mara was right behind me, keeping close, her golden eyes burning in the dark. Behind us, the cabin door slammed open. A voice rang out, sharp, furious. "Find them!" The chase had begun. The wind howled through the trees, tearing through the branches like unseen claws, but the only sound I truly heard was the pounding of my own heartbeat. My breath burned in my chest as I ran, the weight of the bundled pups held tightly against me, their tiny bodies radiating what little warmth they had left. Mara was just behind me, her weakened body moving with a desperate kind of strength, her paws barely making a sound against the frozen ground. We had one chance. Stay ahead, stay unseen, and don't stop. Behind us, the voices grew louder. Footsteps slammed against the earth, boots crunching through frost-covered leaves. They were close, too close. "Fan out!" One of them barked, his voice carrying through the darkness, sharp with frustration. She couldn't have gotten far. I pushed forward, my mind working faster than my feet, scanning the land ahead. The forest was dense, but my cabin had been built near open fields, meaning we wouldn't have the thickest cover for long. If they had flashlights, they'd spot us before we made it out of reach. If they had weapons, we wouldn't stand a chance. Mara faltered slightly, her steps growing uneven, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. I knew she would run herself to the ground before letting them take her pups. But she didn't have the strength for this, not after everything she had been through. I made a split-second decision. Veering hard to the right, I spotted an old hunting shack in the distance, barely standing, its wooden beams crooked with age. It wasn't much, but it was something. I gritted my teeth and forced my legs to move faster, whispering just loud enough for Mara to hear. "This way!" She followed without hesitation, trusting me completely now. The shack loomed closer, its door barely hanging on by rusted hinges. I shoved it open with my shoulder, stepping inside and pressing my back to the wall, shifting the pups to one arm so I could grip the fire poker in the other. Mara slipped in behind me, lowering herself into a tight crouch, her ribs heaving with every breath. The space smelled of damp wood and dust, the floor warped from years of neglect. It wouldn't hold them off for long. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, I saw movement. The flicker of flashlight beams, shadows stretching long against the trees. They were sweeping the area, closing in fast. I held my breath, pressing further into the shadows. Mara stayed still beside me, her golden eyes locked onto the approaching figures, her body tense, poised for whatever came next. The pups whimpered softly against my chest, their tiny sounds barely audible, but in the suffocating silence of the night, even the smallest noise felt like a death sentence. A voice came closer, just beyond the shack's walls. "You see anything?" A pause, then another voice, deeper, angrier. "No, but she's near. I can feel it." My grip on the fire poker tightened until my knuckles ached. A shadow passed across the doorway. The beam of a flashlight skimmed across the entrance. They were right there. Mara let out the softest, lowest growl I had ever heard, barely a sound, but filled with pure warning. My pulse pounded against my ribs. If they stepped inside, there would be no running, no hiding. It would be a fight. Then something changed. A sharp whistle rang out through the trees, one of the men calling the others back. "Forget it," the voice shouted. "We'll wait till morning. She can't run forever." Another pause. Then the shuffle of retreating footsteps, the crunch of boots moving away. I didn't breathe, didn't move, just listened. 5 seconds, 10, 20. Then finally, silence. My chest burned from the effort of staying still, of waiting long after I knew they were gone. My fingers felt numb against the fire poker's handle. My heartbeat still roared in my ears, but slowly, carefully, I loosened my grip. Mara exhaled sharply beside me, her body slumping just slightly, her exhaustion nearly taking over. But she was still alert, still ready. She had fought too hard to let her guard down now. I shifted the pups slightly, letting them press against my warmth, my body still humming with adrenaline. "We can't stay here," I murmured, barely audible over the wind. Mara turned her head toward me, and for the first time I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just trust, not just fear, understanding. She knew as well as I did, this wasn't over. The night stretched long and merciless around us, wrapping the world in an eerie stillness. The wind had quieted, the trees no longer whispering their warnings, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed heavily against my chest. My breath came slow, measured, as I listened, really listened, to the silence. The men were gone, for now, but I knew better than to believe they wouldn't be back. Mara lay close beside me, her body curled tightly around the pups, her ribs rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. Exhaustion had settled into her bones, but she wasn't asleep. Her ears twitched at the faintest sound, her golden eyes half-lidded but alert. She was waiting just like me. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling as I let my head rest against the wooden wall of the shack. We couldn't keep running forever. If we stayed in the wild, hiding from shadows, eventually, something would catch up to us. Whether it was the cold, starvation, or the men who had made it clear they weren't letting this go. And if I tried to take Mara back to my cabin, I would only be leading them straight there, which meant there was only one choice left. I had to end this. Mara shifted, lifting her head slightly, her tired eyes meeting mine as if she already knew what I was thinking. Maybe she did. Maybe she had always known. She had been running for longer than I had, carrying this fight with her long before she had ever stepped into my life. I had only just stepped into her war, but I had made my decision the moment I let her through my door. I wouldn't abandon her now. I reached for my coat, adjusting the pups carefully as I stood. The cold hit instantly, but I ignored it. "Come on, girl," I murmured, moving toward the shack door, peering out into the empty woods beyond. "Time to finish this." Mara didn't hesitate. She pushed herself up, shaking the stiffness from her legs, her body still weak but steady. She stepped toward me, pressing against my side, her head lifting slightly as she took in the scent of the air. I wasn't sure exactly where we were going, but I knew one thing: we weren't running anymore. The men thought they were the hunters, but they had underestimated the fight left in her. And now, for the first time, they were the ones being hunted. Rescue is never as simple as taking in an animal and giving them a home. It's a fight for their survival, for their trust, and sometimes against the ghosts that chased them long before they ever met you. Mara wasn't just another stray, she was a survivor. And now, she wasn't fighting alone. If this story resonated with you, if you believe every animal deserves a second chance, consider supporting your local shelters, volunteering, or even just spreading awareness about the animals who need help the most. And if you want to know what happens next, stay with us. This story isn't over yet, because for Mara and her pups, this is just the beginning.